inside your head and spirit. The soul is saying something profound, so let them hear it.
Welcome to Giant Sized Violence, a Toku Comics podcast. I'm your host Tommy, and today I'm joined by Matt Groom, a podcaster turned comic writer and the co-host of one of my favorite fan casts, Ranger Danger. For the last 10 years, he and co-host Michael Bushuttle have been covering the entire Power Rangers franchise one episode at a time, and occasionally interviewing comic writers like Kyle Higgins and Ryan Parrott along the way. He's since made an impressive leap to the world of comics with incredible creator-owned books like Inferno Girl Red and Self-Made, and worked on some of the most notable tokusatsu heroes of all time, with a 6-issue run on Mighty Morphin from Boom Studios, short story contributions to the Power Rangers 25th and 30th anniversary issues, and co-writing Marvel's Ultraman alongside Kyle Higgins. With no further ado, I'd like to give a big welcome to today's guest, Matt Groom.
Hi, thank you for having me. I think you might know my life better than I do. It was like, wow, I've done a lot of stuff actually on Fun Reflection. There's a lot of work there.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Excited to chat.
Yeah, it's always impressive when someone else does the homework on you. It gives you perspective.
Yeah.
But Matt, I've got to ask, 10 years ago, did you ever think that so much of your life would be shaped by talking about Power Rangers on the internet in your free time?
Oh, absolutely not. No, I think it's quite a year, but almost at first year of the podcast, I think we're averaging between 6 and 12 listeners each episode of the podcast. Mm-hmm. So I think at that point, we were just like, okay, it's just going to be a weird little hobby that we have that's basically exclusively for us. And then the podcast grew a little bit. It's certainly not, a sensation, but it has got its own little niche following. But yeah, obviously the doors that it opened up for me it's wild. It's a lot to take in. And I think as a child, I always wanted to write stories and comics in particular, but I never ever thought it would be possible. So it's been a strange journey for sure.
As far as that growth goes, was that all just kind of natural, like word of mouth, or did you have to put anything into like marketing your podcast to get that audience growth?
The big bump that we had was I paid for one ad read on War Rocket Ajax, which is a comic podcast, I'm not even sure if it's still going, that had some tokusatsu appreciation on it, as well as like some wrestling fans and stuff like that, but it was a big comic focus. And it was just one that I liked, and I had this suspicion that there would be some potential crossover in audience. So I did that, and that seemed to like lift the numbers just enough to start getting a little bit of organic growth going. Any other little things that I tried early on did not work at all. And after that point, I basically decided like, this is a hobby. Whoever listens, whoever doesn't, that's fine. And I stopped really trying to promote the podcast at all. And it was just kind of like slow, gradual growth over the past sort of 10 years. But yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said there for rather than trying to go completely broad. If you're doing something incredibly niche like we're doing, just really try and seek out your particular audience and promote it there. And if you're going to get traction anywhere, it's probably going to be there.
So having had this desire to write comics since you were a kid here, I'd like to ask if like when you started podcasting and started gaining traction, like did you ever see this as something that could help you get your foot in the door in the world of comics, or did that just kind of happen on its own?
Yeah, not at all. I think we were talking Power Rangers on the pod for years, and then one of our listeners actually suggested when Carl Higgins was announced as the writer of the then new Mighty Morphin Power Rangers series at Boom Studios that he come on and do an interview with us, and actually just tagged Kyle in that tweet. And Kyle was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. We did that initial one, and then he really enjoyed the process, and he pitched to us the idea of doing a issue by issue behind the scenes sort of like director's commentary style thing for each issue. And we did that. And very quickly, we realized that we all got along really well and we became friends. And Kyle and I would talk about story constantly. And we ended up getting a pretty sizable behind the scenes perspective on a whole bunch of things. But even at that point, it never really occurred to me that this could be a path, because I think, I didn't want to be the friend who pesters his friend in comics to get him a job, so I didn't mention it at all. But because I, in my day job, do a lot of stuff that's story related, Kyle said, like, hey, like, you seem to have a really good head for this stuff. Have you ever thought about writing comics? And it was at that point I said, like, yeah, it's all I've ever wanted. I just didn't want to be that guy, So he pitched to me the idea of like writing a test script just to see like what my writing style was like, and it would just be a single issue. And I did that, and he read it, and he was like, "Oh, like I really dig this. Can I shop this around to publishers as the editor?" And I hadn't even really conceived it as a real thing. I thought it was just like a test script. But that ended up being the first issue of Self-Made, which was my first Image series. So it was a wild start. And like I definitely am very conscious of both the good fortune and the privilege of being in that position and having that connection, and having my really first ever comic series be an Image series is that doesn't happen. That is a Cinderella story. So I was very fortunate.
Yeah, and it was actually those behind the scenes episodes with Kyle that brought me to your podcast, since I'm the type of weirdo that, like, if I like a comic or I like a writer, I'll be searching, just trying to find interviews with them, and came across your show.
Me too.
And it was right around Shattered Grid, and it was right around those Race into Space episodes when you were covering Turbo, and I'm like, oh, these guys are great. I love this. And
I think we were at the peak of our mental degradation after that stretch of Power Rangers Turbo. So I'm sure that, I've heard from a lot of people that it was entertaining for them, even if it was disastrous for us in terms of our sanity.
How is that going now? Like, I know you're 10 seasons in. I know you've been through many a season that people have talked up that have then been not anywhere near as good as people talk them up to be. So are you getting more of a grasp on how to handle this and stay sane, or have you just embraced the degradation?
Can I ask when this will be published, this podcast episode?
Probably about 3 weeks to a month and a half from now.
Easy. That's great. That's all I need to know. In that case, what I can say is that by the time you've heard this, we will have announced that after Power Rangers Dino Thunder, instead of moving on to Power Rangers SPD, we're taking what we're calling a gap year, which won't actually be a gap because we'll be doing probably a little more work, if anything. But instead of going straight to SPD, we're going to do Tokujo, the Sentai series, as a roughly a year-long break from Power Rangers, which I just needed. I think after Power Rangers Dino Thunder in particular, I was getting to the point where I was not enjoying things so much that I felt like I was making bad podcasts, which I felt really bad about. And I never want to be bringing a downer energy to things. So we're going to do that, take a break. Hopefully that refreshes my batteries, and then come back to SPD in about a year or so. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, I haven't been handling it, so I needed a break.
Let's see. Is that the train season?
That's the train season. Absolutely.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. We wanted to do something that wasn't ever adapted by Power Rangers so that we didn't, ruin that for covering it in the future. So, and we've heard it's good and sort of happy and hopeful and interesting. So I'm hoping that'll, re-energize me.
I can't believe that one didn't get adapted. They're always ready to go back to dinosaurs because every kid loves dinosaurs, but every little boy has a train phase, and I feel like that absolutely is going to fit under the Power Rangers target audience.
Yeah, I don't understand it personally. And I'm a little boy who's still going through his train phase. I'm so stoked to do more train stuff. And I feel like as we unpack all of the many problems in our society and how we've gone astray, I think we've come to realize, at least those who are on sort of the forefront of urban planning and design, that we really need to get back to trains or mass transit in general in a big way. So I feel like it's a Sentai of the moment, it's history has come back to Tokujo. So I'm really, really excited to look at that from that perspective as well.
So let's see, you had the initial script get shopped around that made its way into Self-Made.
Yep.
I think the first time other than that I came across your work was in the 25th anniversary special of Power Rangers. And
that was almost at the same time in terms of publication, yeah.
Yeah, and so how did that opportunity come about, that you went from talking about Power Rangers to getting to write a story about Power Rangers?
Yeah, well, in chatting with Kyle, we got to know Daphne, who at the time was the editor of the Power Rangers books, and we got along quite well. And I would later find out that Daphne was actually a regular listener of the Boom Rooms with Kyle, which was a little mortifying. So I think through that, she was sort of broadly aware of me, and she had read Self-Made and really liked it. So that was, I think, enough of a start to at least do that little bit of contribution. I think that without saying too much specifically, what I've learned in the time since is that there was a little hesitation on the, at the time, Saban side to let anyone who was like as deeply into the fandom as myself take on a larger role. So it took a little while for me to do anything more than that. And I really understand that, by the way. I think I can understand why they would have fears about that. So yeah, it was just that little tiny taste of Power Rangers with Michael at the start. But I'm glad I could come back to it a little later.
Now, when you make this transition from like just talking about it or watching the show and talking about it with your friends to actually writing stories in this universe, where do these stories come from for you? Like, are they things that have kind of been some level of headcanon as you watch the show and like the stories you wish had happened? Or would you say you tailor your stories more to like the assignment itself when you're given, say, a 6-issue run or a short an anniversary special?
Yeah, more the latter. I think that I'm very, with Power Rangers in particular, I'm very conscious of the fact that I am a fan, and a fan who like has been exposed to the brand more than is healthy for any adult. And I want to make sure that that's always tempered by the fact that I am a professional comics writer and I come at it with a professional responsibility first. So when I did my run on Mighty Morphin, I was following a story from Ryan Parrott, and there was like character stuff that had sort of continued on from then. And there was, Ryan was also writing the other series and continuing alongside that. And I knew that there was just a lot of contextual things that I needed to hit to make sure that I was meeting the assignment. And then I also wanted to make sure that, if anything, I sort of took an anti-fan approach to structuring the story, in the sense that I had the secondary cast of Mighty Morphin, or the sort of second wave of characters, being Rocky and Aisha and Adam. And I thought Adam was like the coolest character, and I just never really had a lot of interest in Rocky. And so what I decided to do was take that and try and figure out a story for Rocky and make Rocky compelling to myself in a way that would then hopefully translate to other people, to avoid any chances of me just doing like the fan stuff that I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, once I had a story that I felt met the assignment, was thematically appropriate, had a lot of heart, then I could start layering in some of the fan stuff that I could bring to it. Little references, even down to, there's an incredibly minor tertiary supporting character called Dr. Michael Zaskin from a few seasons down the track that we talked a lot about on the podcast, and I found a spot for him in the story. And that was a fun little moment of like, okay, that's kind of a reference to the podcast in some way, but it was also the case that I needed that sort of character in the story that I was building anyway, so I could do that and bring it in without derailing anything, just to have the fan moment, you know? So yeah, it's really for me about using all of the deep knowledge that I have as beneficial tools to do the job of being a professional storyteller.
I've noticed that you've often made podcasts surrounding your work in comics, like with the Self-Made podcast and the USP Dead Drop for Ultraman. Is this something you felt has benefited your books or your writing in any way? And is it something you think you might do again with your future titles?
That's an excellent question. I would love to do it more in the future. It is time consuming, and I don't think it benefits the books in a mercenary sense. Like, I don't think it's helping your sales.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it adds to the reading experience, and I like to do it for that reason. And I do think it's useful for your craft to be forced to review in depth your work after it's out the door and you can't change it anymore. I think it's just good practice to go through a thorough retrospective, and the fact that it's then broadcast to everyone is kind of secondary to its benefit in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I really dig it, and I think it's something that I have some measure of experience in. Whether I'm good at it or not is, I think, another question. But by volume, I've done a lot of podcasting, so I think it's something that I could bring to it that is hopefully beneficial and people enjoy. And I think I'm like you in that, like, the craft is so fascinating to me. Like, I love hearing how things are made and all of the beautiful and strange stories of creation. And if I can help put a bit more of that into the world, then all the better.
I mean, honestly, Ranger Danger kind of set the bar for what I look for in a fan cast. And damn it if y'all didn't set that bar too high, because like I do find it hard to find that same level of quality. Granted, in the wild west of podcast editing or podcast publishing, there's a lot of people that just skip the editing process altogether, so like we can crop out those, but like I loved seeing you expand to these other comics, and I loved the Boom Room episodes. Like, it was great getting to hear that same dynamic between you and Michael brought to other subjects that weren't filler episodes of Power Rangers.
Yes.
And I do find with comic podcasts especially, like, there are some that, like, it feels like we're just trying to get people to promote the exact book they're working on now, when I've always really loved the more conversational ones, or the ones that get into a writer's backstory, like Kevin Smith's early Fat Man on Batman episodes, or Word Balloon with Michael Suntrace. John Suntrace. And so, yeah, like, just I feel like going further down into like every single issue rather than just promoting a book vaguely in general. I think the retrospective really helps and like just gives you a much better idea of what the creator is trying to do, where this is coming from, and like it's awesome to hear about what could have been.
It also just means we can actually talk about stuff. Like, I think, you know, I've had to do the podcast circuit where you're talking about an upcoming book because you need to try and sell the book to try and pay rent, but you can't ever really talk about it with any sort of meaning because the audience hasn't listened to it and you don't want to spoil anything. Whereas the like post-issue breakdown means you can really get into the weeds of stuff and like really talk about craft and not have to hold anything back. So as much as like I don't think it's necessarily a useful sales tool, I do think it's just like it's a good thing to put out there. So I am keen to do more of it.
Having done so many podcasts, have you ever considered using it for a narrative medium, like as a way to revisit the world of Self-Made, or like a world-building supplement for Inferno Girl Red, like we've seen with the Who Is No One podcast?
Yeah, well, I actually did a bit of writing on Who Is No One.
Ooh.
So I certainly through that have had a sort of an introduction to how to write narrative in that sort of way. Obviously, the nature of that one in particular is very like in situ, like it's a podcast within the universe, so it takes the form of a podcast. But yeah, it's something that we thought about. I know for all of our Massiveverse books, we've talked about the idea of even like audiobooks, and if that makes sense. It's so tough though, because it's very hard for us to know what the market is for that and what the reach is, and if it's worth the opportunity cost. Especially with the Massiveverse, because we own everything. We have a lot of options of like what we could be doing. Like we have our fighting card game coming out this year in a couple of months for that, which is really cool. But that took time to organize, and yeah, we're constantly making decisions about what to do and what not to do with that. But I think one of the huge benefits of working at Image is that you have that complete freedom, and we have that ability to just push the medium of comics, but then push beyond the medium of comics in whatever way we feel, and we don't have to worry about getting anyone on corporate side, you know? So yeah, that stuff's always on our mind, and I would definitely say that we're thinking about that stuff all the time.
Now, on Ultraman, you jumped from one massive Toku franchise to another, from Power Rangers to this, and also had the task of reimagining like one of the biggest global superhero franchises of all time for a new American audience. What was your knowledge of Ultraman like before working on the book, and like what was the research and world building process like for the book's development?
Yeah, it was interesting because I think that my knowledge of Ultraman was pretty slim at the start. I think like I was aware of Ultraman, but I think one of the driving reasons behind Super Ray's big push now is that for a long time, because of thorny and boring legal reasons, Ultraman didn't really have a presence in the West. And that was particularly true, I think, in Australia, where I'm from. Ultraman basically didn't exist. But as I dove more into Ultraman, I came to realize how much I sort of was familiar with it, because it was the foundation of everything that I loved. It was kind of like an even more extreme version of when I first discovered Super Sentai, and I was like, oh, this is where the good stuff that I like from Power Rangers started. And it's just like following that all the way back further towards the source. So it was a fascinating experience. And even going back to those early episodes and realizing that so much of early Ultraman and Ultra 7, and even I think particularly Ultraman Ace, there's a lot of homage and crossover with Thunderbirds and what Jerry Anderson was doing across the pond, because it was that same love of pushing the medium of television by trying to capture the scale of film by doing it at a smaller scale but representing it as big. So yeah, it was just like a real journey of discovery, and it really just came down to sitting down and just watching all of Ultraman and a lot of Ultraman 7 and a bit of Ultraman Ace, and then dipping in the smallest way to the modern stuff. I didn't want to do too much of that because Super Rai is pretty clear that like that's not what we're doing. It's more focused on the classics. And then it was speaking to Super Rai through Starlight Runner, which was the company that Super Rai had sort of organized to be like the go-between between us and them, which is led by Jeff Gomez, who's a great guy and a lifelong Ultraman fan. So having that conversation about the history of Ultraman, but also what Ultraman is to them and what they want Ultraman to be and the meaning behind it. And also what they wanted to get out of the project. Because I think when we were first approached by Marvel for this, Kyle and I had a little bit of hesitation because, you know, we're two white guys and this is a Japanese icon. And we didn't know, you know, if we even had the right to tell this story. But then in talking to Super Rai, it was made very clear that what they are looking for in this was a westernized version. They wanted to see like what is Ultraman through the Marvel comic lens. And the way they kind of put it was like, we're doing Ultraman. Like, we have the show, there's a manga, like, you're not taking over Ultraman, you're adapting Ultraman. And we want it to have that lens through it. And I think that helped us clarify what we were doing. It made us a little bit more comfortable doing a reimagination of it. But it also clarified like the ethos of Ultraman. And I think I've dealt with corporations before on this stuff. I was expecting a lot of notes about like all the things that you don't do and make sure you get all these tiny little details right on the costume and things like that. And they're very careful with that stuff, but what they are much more interested in was the heart of the character and what Ultraman means and represents, and the idea of Ultraman being kind of an enlightened figure who leads with empathy and inspires hope and only resorts to violence as a last resort was, yeah, it was very cool to see like what is ostensibly a corporation, but no, this is the most important thing. And we sort of built around that. And it was really interesting timing actually, because I was also thinking a lot about Western superheroes and some of the, I think, inherent problems with them as they exist now, and how they are kind of defenders of the status quo at a time when the status quo sucks for a lot of people, and maybe the most heroic thing isn't like making sure nothing drastically changes, you know? And I think Ultraman's a character that he's not out fighting crime, you know, like he has no interest in punitive justice. What he does have interest in is protecting humans from their darkest demons, but also hoping to show them a way to a better way of living and a sort of more communal, empathetic way of being. And I thought that was dope as hell. So I think like once I sort of wrapped my head around that, I was in, and I felt comfortable building a world and a history from scratch and sort of, yeah, expanding that out into what we created.
Yeah, like it seems like a lot of what works at the heart of Superman that a lot of modern comics, I think, kind of stray away from, or like just kind of gets lost in the weeds of continuity and 80 years 100%. Of storytelling. Like, I feel like it's there with Ultraman, and it works almost better because he's a literal being of light and more of that kind of ghostly Christ-like figure, like some kind of Holy Spirit literally possessing people and helping them lead themselves to a better future, rather than just being the defender of every small problem and criminal activity or supervillain.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think that in some ways, the fact that Ultraman doesn't look like a man is a little beneficial, and just like to keep reminding people that this isn't just a guy, it's a being that has a cosmic awareness and experience that lets him live in a way that's hopefully a little kinder. And I think in the same way as Superman, I think that our hope for everyone is that as we become more powerful collectively, that means that we are less vulnerable and we don't have to live in a fear-based place, and because of that, we can be more emotionally vulnerable because we're not physically vulnerable. And of course, that doesn't always happen. But I think that's the dream of Superman is a guy who doesn't have to ever worry really that he's going to be physically harmed, and because of that, it's helped him cultivate a real kindness and open-mindedness. And the Ultra as a species, I think, are kind of the same way. They've reached a level of existence where they don't hate anymore at all, and they don't have a reactionary tendency towards violence, and but because of that, they can just show us a way of being that's a little healthier. And I can understand that for a lot of people, and I think this is sometimes where people trip up with Superman, it is tough to build a story around that in some ways, or at least a traditional superhero story. But I think it's an important challenge and one that we should be engaging in rather than just having Superman, punish bank robbers, because that's not necessarily, I think as we're learning progressively, a way to build a better society.
I have been curious about the future of Ultraman at Marvel. Like, I know there's something of a Marvel or Avengers crossover book that you were working on, and I've had trouble finding information about like a release date or if it's still happening. Is there anything you're allowed to speak to regarding the next Ultraman book?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a massive delay on, I think what we're calling at the moment, Ultraman X Avengers. I'm not exactly sure what the final title will be. And I don't really understand the nature of the delay. I think it was a Marvel Super Rare thing that they had to sort out. But whatever it is, it's sorted, and we are back in production, and it's coming this year.
Oh, excellent.
It's on the way. I'm very excited. The extremely detailed outline has been approved by everyone in the chain. I was writing some Spider-Man dialogue yesterday, which is wild for me as a human being. So yeah, it's happening, and I think it's pretty cool. And I think it was a bit of a process getting everyone around the table to sort of like find the right path, and there's a lot of interested parties in a lot of ways, but I think we got to something that's really interesting, and I think you get a lot of just the kind of fun stuff you might want to see from these two interacting, but I also think there's a little room for us to examine some of what we've been talking about, the differences between Western superheroes and Ultraman, and them literally coming face to face to each other and experiencing a bit of each other's philosophy is going to be interesting for everybody. So yeah, it's coming this year. I'm not exactly sure when, but definitely this year. It's in production, and I think it's going to be pretty cool.
And is this the last planned Ultraman comic from Marvel, to your knowledge, or will there be like a continuation on the trilogy of minis you and Kyle have done so far?
I don't know if there are going to be any more thereafter. There's more planned in the sense that when Kyle and I first pitched that, we pitched out everything that currently exists, including this crossover, and then many more stories thereafter. So like, we've got the stories if the sales appetite is there. I just don't know at this stage if there will be any. I think like we were pretty clear up front that we are telling a really large overarching story, and I think as people read, they probably got more and more of a sense of that. And I think in the spirit of trying to learn for Tokusatsu, one of the things that we were very firm on when we started was this isn't just a status quo ongoing thing. We had an end to the story planned from when we started it. And I would say that we are probably somewhere around halfway through that. So ideally, we'd like to do some more, but I have no idea whether or not we'll see any more after the crossover. I hope so. Hopefully the crossover helps lift awareness as well, and that helps us do more.
On that larger world, like, one of my favorite things about the Ultraman comics so far has been the short stories in the back of each first issue of each miniseries. And I know you mentioned on the USP Dead Drop podcast that page space was kind of a battle in the book, especially those oversized issues. So were these stories in the back like a casualty of that battle, or were they always intended to just be in the first issue of each mini?
No, they were always intended to be in the first issue of the mini. They actually came about because Tom Brevoort, our editor, said to us, the first issues are going to be a little oversized. We'd like to do some back matter stuff. And I think because that was part of the plan from the start, I think, before we even really pitched. So we actually kind of built our pitch and the plan for everything around that, because he had mentioned offhand, like, maybe we could involve Ultra Q in some way. Because Tom Brevoort's a big Tokusatsu or Ultraman guy, I should mention as well. And so we had that in mind. And he also said, like, it's fine if you guys don't want to do this, we can go to someone else, or we can not do it. But there's this thing called Kaiju Step in Japan, and like maybe there's something fun we could do there. And I basically jumped through my computer to grab Tom and be like, we're doing that. No, don't you give that away. That's mine. So yeah, it was part of from the start. And I think we realized early on that because we had this big history that we'd invented, that we'd want to see the past and we'd want to lay some breadcrumbs for this huge overarching story that we're telling. And the idea was that with each first issue of each mini, you'd get another little bit of that to help contextualize this sort of grander story, even as we're doing the sort of smaller mini stories.
That's been one of the more fun things about revisiting your Ultraman comics now, because when Rise first came out, I hadn't started this podcast yet. Originally, it was Ultra Mega that came out like right afterwards that spurned me into doing a
Ultra Mega's great.
Oh, good. I'm glad you've read it now. I remember last time I saw you, you were like keeping your distance as to not let it influence your Ultraman
I think
books.
because there's been that huge delay with Ultraman Avengers, like I had a big Ultraman break, and that allowed me to be like, okay, I think I could read this now without sort of being too influenced.
But yeah, like I didn't know nearly as much about Ultraman going into it, but then like catching like, oh yeah, Kaiju Steps, and oh, that's a deep cut, or like the subtle reference to Ultraman in a business suit, and the other subtle nods. I'm like, oh wow, like now that I've gained so much more Toku knowledge through osmosis, I'm seeing this is all here. Wow.
Absolutely. And you know, like as I said, Kyle and I weren't immersed in Ultraman when we started, but we still wanted to, as much as we were doing a fresh take and a new history, still like add that stuff in that hopefully people who are lifelong fans, like they get a little bit of that reward in the same way that, you know, I would get that sort of reward from Deep Cut Power Ranger stuff if I were reading it.
Switching over to your own Toku hero here with Inferno Girl Red. Since you've gotten to write some of the biggest Toku heroes on the planet, I'd love to know, like, going into Inferno Girl Red, what you are hoping to bring to the table with the new original character that you didn't get to do elsewhere.
Oh, a bunch of stuff. I think I put a lot of my hopes and dreams and intentions into Inferno Girl Red, because there's a lot of stuff I just wanted to solve. I think a lot of it started with, in doing Self-Made, realizing the true freedom of Image Comics. I think specifically there was a cover for issue 5 of Self-Made, which is our main character Amala kind of falling through a kaleidoscopic background that is like perfectly symmetrical. And I had the thought of, oh, what if we did the trade dress like mirrored, so it's all on the left and then it's sort of like reverse mirrored on the other side. And we tried that out and it looked terrible and we didn't do it. But just going through that process, I was like, oh, we could have just done that. Like, we can do anything. And having that realization, the responsibility of that suddenly like really crashed down on me. And I realized like I want to do something meaningful with this. So what I wanted to do was a few different things. One of them was create a truly accessible superhero series for younger readers. Something that I think helped address some of the inherent problems of the comics market. Because there was a Facebook group of my local comic book store, and someone on there was asking like, hey, my niece has seen all of the Marvel movies, is really into them and would like to get into comics. Where's a good place to start? And I really struggled for the right suggestion, because I came in on Ultimate Spider-Man, which I think is killer, but it's also like 25 years old now, and it feels it in the way that like it's not about young people today. You know, it's not that, as great as it still is. And I thought about like Miss Marvel, which I absolutely love, but it gets reset every, 30 or less issues now. So there's a bunch of volume 1s, and even at the end of that first issue of Miss Marvel, it's like deeply tied into all of the Inhuman stuff that was going on at the time. And I was like, oh, that doesn't really feel like a clean recommendation. And DC was doing a bunch of YA-specific OGNs that are really cool. And like I got a bunch of them and I really dig them. But they're also like one and done. Like if you really dug that story, it's kind of like, well, great, find something else. It doesn't continue. So I felt like there should be a superhero series that felt fresh and modern, that was an easy, accessible like starting point, that just went 1, 2, 3, that, you know, could go to the book market or go to libraries and just like work. So Inferno Girl Red was trying to create that. And it was also a byproduct of some of the stuff we've been talking about me thinking about superheroes and what they mean, and like the idea of superheroes kind of being cops and like that maybe not necessarily being the coolest thing. And I was like, what could we do to create a new type of superhero story that isn't grounded in that idea, that isn't about someone who's policing the status quo, but is actually trying to hopefully improve things. And that was where a lot of the tokusatsu influence started to come in. And obviously we've, you know, referenced that a lot visually, and Erica and Igor, my artist and colorist, are both big anime people, so a lot of that came in kind of naturally as well. But it started more from a place of trying to learn from tokusatsu storytelling principles and how that can help us avoid some of the pitfalls I think we've fallen into in Western superhero storytelling. So yeah, all of that stuff came together, and also just a feeling of like, I feel like superhero comics in some way can be cooler than they are right now.
Yes.
And even down to like, I have a big passion for, I feel like every part of the comic making process should be done by people who are at the top of their game, doing the coolest stuff they can do. And I feel like often design is something that gets left out of that, is the equation. Not always. Obviously, Jonathan Hickman has really pushed that forward. Like when he's on a book, suddenly the standards like, they go right up. And, you know, there are like designers doing good work in comics, but it's not necessarily the main priority. So I wanted to make sure that that was a part of it. And that's something that's shared across the Massiverse as well. So yeah, it's just all of that stuff, me trying to make what is hopefully a very cool superhero comic for everybody, especially for young readers.
The book, I've noticed, has been comprised of oversized 3-issue arcs. And I'm curious if that's been difficult in like adjusting your pacing with your writing process to fit like 3 oversized issues or like a 3-issue arc in comparison to what you've done elsewhere, or if the story just kind of lends itself well to this oversized issue structure.
Yeah, actually, the oversized issue sizes are actually a bit of a byproduct of another one of my intentions for Inferno Girl Red, which was I wanted it to read like a novel, because I think that novels, in terms of their story structure, are what people outside of comics are familiar with. And I think that writing 20-page singles, if you're doing that right, it results in a trade that doesn't necessarily have the structure of a novel. And like, I love single issues. When I was writing Self-Made, I took a lot of joy in the idea that like each issue should be, in as much as it progresses the overall story, a story in and of itself. It should have a thematic meaning and a conclusion, and also have a vibe and a feeling all of its own. But I didn't want that for Inferno Girl Red. I wanted it to just be a 120-page novel that didn't have to, every 20 pages, find itself to a like come back next month cliffhanger. So I just wrote it as a 120-page novel. And then we realized after the fact that because of that, and it having kind of a traditional 3-act structure, while it didn't lend itself to being divided into 20-page issues, it roughly could be released as 40-page issues. It ended up being, I think the first one was 45 and the last one was 35 or something like that. So it's not a totally equal split. It was more just we can release it this way into the direct market without compromising the novel structure, which to me was the most important part. So if anything, it was very easy because I did it by accident.
So you've launched both volumes of this so far, with the second one upcoming here through Kickstarter campaigns.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know how you say that this Kickstarter model has treated you, and if you'd recommend it for other aspiring creators. And I'll admit I ask with some self-interest because I'm looking down the path of my first Kickstarter release, and it's pretty intimidating.
Oh, yeah, 100%. It's tough. I'm always very, hesitant to really provide advice because I'm very cognizant of the fact that this kind of unique relationship I have with Image is not what everyone has. In fact, it's what very few people have. And it benefits us greatly. So I don't want to be like, oh, we did it, you can do it too, because that's not being entirely honest with everyone about the circumstances. But I think that Kickstarter is incredible. It's also difficult and it's scary. I think the first campaign showed us a lot of the benefits and the pitfalls. We swung for the fences and had this huge plan, and then Erica ended up hospitalized for months on end and literally couldn't pick up a spoon. So that like blew out our timelines, and then there was like the post-COVID shipping crisis, and like there was a lot of costs on stuff changed, so I ended up paying a lot more than we actually took in on the first one, and that was really financially dicey for me for a long time. So that was really difficult, but also the sense of community that came through the Kickstarter was incredible. And whenever, like, I would feel so bad having to go to people and be like, hey guys, it's going to be longer than I thought, you know, Erica's in the hospital, but almost unanimously, very, 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 very close to unanimously, the response to that was, that's totally fine. Like, make sure Erica's health comes first. The book will come out when it comes out. We know you're working on it. And like the fan art and the enthusiasm and just the sense of community that came up around it was absolutely incredible. So I felt like we felt the range of it on the first one. And then on the second one, I feel like whatever scary experiences we didn't capture in the first one, we captured in the second one, because the first one, we hit our funding target basically immediately. On the second one, we did not. Part of that is because we had to raise the funding goal significantly because, as I said, we discovered real costs that weren't accounted for on the first one, and we still wanted to make sure everyone got paid a living wage. So the number had to be way higher, and that was much harder to hit. And I think also it was because some idiot ruined a social media platform, and suddenly the reach that I was getting was like 10 to 20% of what I used to have. And that was kind of our only outreach form, you know? So that was rough. So yeah, those things combined led to the fact that I think we were like in our last 48 hours maybe when we got funded. And given the size and significance of everything involved, that probably took a few years off my life in terms of anxiety. So it was tough. So yeah, I think Kickstarter is incredible. I think it's a platform that really does help to democratize the publishing of comics and takes away some of the gatekeepers. And I think that's incredibly valuable. I also would just say to anyone thinking about it is just like go in with both eyes open. It can be a bit scary. There are risks, and that's not a reason to not do it necessarily. You just want to make sure that you're emotionally and prepared and as logistically prepared as you can be going into it.
Now, going into book 2, though, I'd like to know where this one takes place in relation to Volume 1, and also in relation to her appearance in Supermassive. Is this going to be picking up right where the first book left off, or are we going to have any kind of time skip, or what are you able to share?
We're going to have a short time skip of a couple of weeks, maybe even a little less. So days to weeks in between book 1 and book 2. And I can say that the end of book 2 leads directly into Supermassive, like to the moment. So if you have been reading Supermassive, you'll appreciate that and understand that and have a much better understanding of how things all fit together logistically. But as ever, and I always take great pains to stress this, you do not have to know anything about Supermassive. You don't have to read Supermassive. If you just read Inferno Girl Red book 1 and book 2, you'll be able to read book 3 without any sort of confusion or feeling like you've lost anything or anything like that. But one of the, if I can say, most impressive things I think we've done with the Massiveverse is construct this thing where each book is entirely standalone and you can just read 1, 2, 3 without any crossovers or anything disrupting anything. But if you do read the crossovers, you get a deeper understanding of the characters and you get to enjoy their interactions, and their where they place in the timeline is meaningful emotionally for all the characters. It's been a tremendously difficult tightrope to walk, but I'm so proud to have done it that way because I do think it's the best of both worlds. You can just read whatever title you're interested in and there's no confusing reading orders or anything like that. But if you do want to read a little wider, you get, I think, what is a very cool sort of added experience.
Now, I know you spoke in some detail on the Radiant Black podcast last year about the world building of Inferno Girl Red and everything that went into it with you and your artist, and with the whole construction of a parallel universe to the rest of the Massiveverse titles. I'm curious if there's like any juicy world building bits that like you got really excited about with Inferno Girl Red that like, I guess I wonder if there's any gems within that world building that you fear you won't be able to get to in the book, or like anything that fundamentally makes this world different that will be hard to get to in a story focused on Cassia.
I'm not too worried about it. I mean, my only fear really is just that like it won't be financially viable and we won't be able to do anymore. But both Erica and myself have a very robust understanding of this world and all of its implications, and the legacy of Inferno Girl Red and all the unseen stories that might have come before. And I think that that's something that, you know, we touched on a little earlier, the idea of like expanded media, that we could absolutely do meaningful stuff in that space. So I think the potential is huge, and we're not limited logistically by anything. Again, that's that beautiful image freedom. The only concern at this point is like, can we afford to keep making comics? Which, you know, is a perennial concern. But my hope is that as we continue, we'll be able to have the core of Cassia's thread remain, you know, cohesive and standalone, but we'll have opportunities to branch out other threads that people can follow if they have that desire.
So with that note of the legacy of Inferno Girl Red, like we know that there's a previous Inferno Girl going off the opening of issue 1. Would you be able to speak to like how big is that legacy? Like, are we talking like 1 or 2 generations before the one we've seen, or something much longer like in Rogue Sun, or is that just something you want to keep a mystery for the time being?
I think people who have read last year's Supermassive will have been given some hints to that. But what I would say is like it is a unthinkably long history, and it's a multiversal history. So there have been a great many Inferno Girl Reds, and we certainly having some fun exploring that idea and what that means to Cassia. Because like, as you pointed out, within the realm of the core story we're telling right now, we have a current Inferno Girl Red, and we have a previous Inferno Girl Red as main characters of the story. But something that we'll touch on a little bit in book 2 is the broader legacy. And there will be more hints about that to be found, even kind of building on what was seen in the last Supermassive as well.
As we wrap up here, I try to ask a question of the week tailored to each guest, just something a little more fun and off topic, but say you're pushed through a multiversal portal.
Yep.
You now have to live in a universe where you and Michael made a long-running podcast dedicated to any other show but Power Rangers. What show would you want it to be, and how do you think that would shape your life?
Oh, Super Sentai, unquestionably. I have this thought, like, every 2 days. It's just, like, we could have been watching a good show for 10 years. Imagine how great that would be.
Feels like a cop-out answer there. Just
Look, that's because it's such a, like, you know, that's not even a theoretical one. That's a, like, I've thought many times, and we're kind of acting upon that now. I guess if it was to be further afield, I think for one of our Patreon specials, we watched the first 2 or 3 episodes of Alf, and it felt potent. I feel like there is something about Alf that is like uncomfortably, and I think a little unknowingly, incisive about American society. And I think that through the eyes of Alf, we can see a lot of the problems and the degradation of community that has sort of like rippled out and caused a lot of the problems we're experiencing today. So I think that it's like a fascinating, and like that's kind of true of all sitcoms, except for the fact that like the appearance of an alien character coming in helps give that external lens to it as well. So definitely Alf. Michael and I have like talked before about like, can we get the rights to Alf? Because I think the idea of a modern Alf series, like a guy who came to Earth and lived in suburban America in kind of like Reaganite America, where that guy is today would be fascinating and kind of haunting. So yeah, there's obviously I thought way too much about Alf, so Alf is probably the answer there.
I'm sorry, Through the Eyes of Alf is such a like beautiful and powerful title that like you need to make that into a book or something that's like a real big deconstruction on the issues in the modern world and how they relate back to Alf and how it all ties to Alf.
As I said, I've thought a lot about it. It's again, it's all opportunity cost, right? Like doing so many things, and maybe one day my Alf deconstruction will be part of it.
But I would just like to say, as we close here, that thank you again, Matt, for coming on the show. I really can't stress enough how much of an inspiration Ranger Danger was for me in starting my own podcast 2 years ago. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do with Inferno Girl Red Volume 2.
Thank you. That brings me a lot of happiness. I'm glad that we can help create more positive stuff. And this has been great. I think you're great at this. So
thank you.
Always happy to come on and have a chat with cool people about stuff. It's one of the joys of the job.
But would you like to tell our listeners where they can follow you and learn more about Inferno Girl Red going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter as Matthew Groom. That's Matthew with one T, Groom, all one word. Inferno Girl Red is on Twitter at Inferno Girl Red, all one word. They're probably the best places to hear from me. I have a website, macroom.com, where I have a contact box if you want to reach me about anything. It takes me a little while to come back and sort through that stuff, but I do check it. And yeah, I think those are the main things. Big announcement coming in February, I think. And hopefully we'll have an announcement date for Ultraman X Avengers very soon. Yeah, some big stuff coming.
Gotcha. Well, if the listeners at home have any requests or recommendations for content you'd like us to cover in the future, you can send them our way on social media. You can find us on the Giant Size Violence Facebook page, on Twitter as @UltraMegaCast, or email us at giantsizeviolence@gmail.com. We'd like to thank you again for giving our podcast a chance, and give a special shout out to artists Ray Day Parade and Dark Moon Home Video for designing our logo and cover photos. Our intro and outro music is You're an Ace Kid by DEMONDICE from their album Alcatraz. You can check out their EP, Shut Up, Get Happy, on iTunes and Spotify. We hope you join us again as we continue to explore the world of tokusatsu comics. But until next time, take care and remember to do your part in preventing the spread of the kaiju virus.
Freedom can't be seen by downcast eyes. So raise your gaze until you're 10 feet tall. And shake your fist to the sky. Refuse to try or let them make you small. Cause they love just to see you convinced you're just a brick in the wall. But you're not just a brick in the wall. La da 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 da.